Leave me alone! Ah!
Akira is one of the most influential films in history, and is regarded as one of the greatest animated films of all time. However, having recently finished reading the manga, and I realised the film really shouldn't work. Now, the film kind of covers the first 3 volumes of the manga, and then some of the ending volume, and a story that has to tell quite a very ambitious story in just 2 hours and 4 minutes. Now, why do I think it works when it shouldn't? First off, creative control. Now, I want to compare it to another famous sci-fi adaptation of large ambition, that being 1984's Dune.
Some idea of what I could do. Don't try your powers on me.
Dune is quite famous for its disastrous production hell and eventually flopping when it came out, and so much so, David Lynch, the director of the film, has tried to rid himself of any involvement in the project. Now, the film tries to condense the novel into one film, which in recent adaptations found out it would be almost impossible, and due to this and the fact the film had half an hour omitted from the theatrical release, it made the film literally incomprehensible.
One will come, the voice from the outer world, bringing the holy war.
And had a large studio interference, thus Lynch couldn't really make Dune his. Now let's compare that to Akira. Now of course Akira has the advantage of the creator of the manga being the director. However, he only did do the film with his own creative control, and with the film being an adaptation of a story that hadn't even ended yet. And he even stated that doing the film was one of the worst ideas ever. However, despite its almost impossible nature, he did make the film. And because of this, the film has some benefits and also has some disadvantages, as it allowed him to kind of create 2 endings to a story, and thus involvement from the original creator helped the film tenfold, as it really feels like Akira. Of course, the biggest thing that helps it is the animation, which to this day feels fresh and unique, so much so the bike slide has been referenced in a lot of American animations. And because of this, the animation, it can hide the fact of the characters not really being that all well fleshed out, as the animation is so gorgeous that you kind of ignore that fact. Next is the imagery of the film. While it may not have the most well written characters, it's helped by the imagery throughout the film. It's very eye catching and memorable. From Kaneda's red jacket to the design of the espers to the ending, which while weird is very memorable. Next is Kaneda and Tetsuo's dynamic. Now, I have mentioned about the films not having great characters. However, despite that, there are 2 very memorable characters, Kaneda and Tetsuo. Now, Kaneda is a weird character and is portrayed as not very likeable. He's supposed to be a delinquent teenager, which of course makes sense as to why he's like that. And then there's probably the film's best character, Tetsuo, who's totally a great villain. His impulsivity, his love of violence, he's a well-established character. He feels mistreated and looked down upon, and once he gets power, he abuses it. And he is one of the most iconic villains in animation history, and is a great metaphor for the misuse of power and the threat of nuclear weapons. And lastly, what makes the film work is the coolness. Now this might sound like a strange point, however I think the coolness of a film, the jackets, the bikes, even the music, really helps the film. And I think has helped other films as well. Take for example The Matrix, specifically the sequels, as the first film is fantastic. However, the sequels aren't that great, however they do have good stuff in them. Of course, the highway action scene, which is of course very very cool. Another example in Japanese cinema, that being the film Ichi the Killer. The film, while I think is fine, has its main protagonist, who even on all the posters is the main focus due to his coolness and eye-catching nature. Overall, I believe there are things that could have and should have went against Akira being nothing but a mess. However, they were able to take a highly ambitious story and condense a series that took 8 years to complete into one film, and it turned out to be a masterpiece. In Japanese cinema, there is someone who, at least to me, is quintessential viewing, and that is Takeshi Kitano. Now, Kitano, or as he's known in Japan, Beat Takeshi, is a comedian who started out, of course, as a comedian, in a thing known as manzai, in which two people perform a routine, one telling the jokes while the other acts it out or reacts in an over-the-top way.
さんには不親切ですから。本当に親切してんの？親切は本当に親切ですよ。この間なんかおばあちゃんに道聞かれましてね、銀座で親切近道よ近道。近道教えて。おばあさん喜んで高速道路をテクテク歩いてきました。ダメだ。
He was a massive media personality in Japan, so much so when he tried to play a serious role in the film, that being 1983's Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence, he found that the audience laughed at him despite the film being an anti-war film. This would affect his career for many years due to his comedy background. But he would then strike fame with his TV show Takeshi's Castle, which is a game show which involved partaking in dangerous challenges in order to eventually take over Takeshi's Castle for the hefty prize of 1 million yen, which equates to 500 British pounds, which doesn't really seem worth it considering the things the contestants went through.
Really testing your suit. There you are, now.
I was screaming for dramatic effect.
Well, I was moved by it. And here you are, ready to take on the second boulder. Wow!
That being the thing that he is known for mostly around the world, outside of Japan of course, due to influencing other game shows such as Total Wipeout, or Wipeout as it's known in America, and just the overall insanity of the show, and it's still well known and remembered today. Now, on to his films. Now, Kitano was cast in a film called Violent Cop, which was supposed to be directed by Kenji Fukasaku, who was one of Japan's greatest filmmakers, who pulled out, and thus Kitano directed and rewrote the script, but uncredited himself. The film follows Kitano, who plays Azuma, a gambling addict and aggressive cop, who lives with his intellectually disabled sister, who he is very protective of. His friend Iwaki is found out to be selling drugs within the police force, in which he is eventually killed and his sister is kidnapped, and thus he must literally break the law in order to find those responsible. A key thing in all of Kitano's films is the plot doesn't really matter, in the sense it's not really the point of the story or what he's focusing on. Now, this film is probably Kitano's weakest, largely due to the fact it's his first time directing, and thus he's not going to be perfect with the film, sometimes the film feeling quite unfocused. However, it would have glimpses of what would be Kitano's black comedy style. It's made obvious throughout the film what Azuma is quite a morally grey, irresponsible character. For example, allowing his fellow policemen to get beat up while not intentionally he does allow them to, and beating up kids, which while not good people, they are still children. And in this scene in which he finds Iwaki's murderer and the man who kidnapped his sister, he tries to kill him while the police officers try to prevent him from doing so, even eventually shooting another police officer by accident. The film having some great individual scenes, the most famous probably being around a 10-minute sequence in which a murder suspect takes the police at least 10 minutes to catch him due to their incompetency, 3 of them getting beat up, one's head bashed in with a baseball bat, and Azuma eventually having to run him over twice in order to catch him. The main critique of this scene, however, being whether or not the music was necessary due to it telling the audience what to feel. This is something Kitano would improve on later on in his other films, but overall is a great first feature. Boiling Point is the film in which Kitano started to find his own signature style, using much longer takes, quick bursts of extreme violence, with minimal music, especially in this film, editing cut into an aftermath of a scene, and a signature dark but funny black comedy style. This film is very strange in the fact it has 2 main characters, who are in some way the same version of the same person. The film starts with a scene in which the main character, a lousy bored baseball player known as Masaki, who doesn't know the rules of the game, walking out of the toilet, which will be important later on. He eventually gets himself mixed up with the Yakuza. He along with his friend decide to buy a gun for safety, and end up in Okinawa, which happens in a lot of Kitano's films, in which a large chain of violence occurs. Now the film is quite interesting as there seems to be a lot more going on subliminally. Two main characters seem to be a weird yin and yang version of each other, as despite his bold nature, Masaki is able to enter a loving relationship and stand up for himself. Meanwhile, during literally the midpoint of the film, Kitano enters the picture, becoming the main protagonist, playing a sadistic, abusive Yakuza member who forces his friend to cut off his finger and to have sex with his girlfriend, even eventually trying to sodomize that same friend. A lot of the comedy coming from Kitano himself and his constant hitting and abuse of his girlfriend. The film sort of suggesting the idea that Makasaki sees himself like the Yakuza that Kitano plays. However, throughout the film he grows to hate that viewpoint. The film culminating in Kitano killing the Yakuza boss in Okinawa, however, eventually being killed himself, alongside his friend, while Masaki drives a truck into the Yakuza building in Tokyo, and it explodes, and it ending how the film started, suggesting whether or not it happened or if it's going to happen, or that if Masaki wants to be a gangster, a sort of dream sequence. This film establishing what Kitano would later go on to do with his other films. This is Kitano's game changer film, and his other non-gangster films, one that is called Getting Any, in which the whole point is the main character wants to have sex in a car. Yes, I'm being serious. He had started to collaborate with Joe Hisaishi, who is one of the most well-known composers of all time, and is known for his work with Studio Ghibli, and is one of the best composers of all time. And it's very noticeable as the film's main song is incredible. The film takes place, again, in Okinawa, in which Yakuza members are sent to deal with a gang war. However, it becomes increasingly obvious that they have been set up to be killed. Now, the film is one of Kitano's most substantive films, as its main focus is really on the pointlessness of the Yakuza and their, existentialism they go through during this film, and the violence they cause, with them realising there is a better way of life, outside of the criminal world. Now, a lot of the film scenes just deal with them essentially having fun on the beach, or dancing, the most famous scene being one in which they play Russian roulette. This feeling of increasing nihilism is evident in the film, mostly demonstrated brilliantly in the sudden bursts of violence. Due to their almost disappointing nature. This is truly enhanced during the final scene in which he goes to Yakuza clan building and kills both clans. However, we don't see it, thus shielding us from the violence, which in reality we don't really have to see, and provides an anti-violence message, as each of the other characters will go on to continue to be hunted down. However, there is a young guy who is with Kitano before he does this, and throughout the film he swears he must get revenge, thus continuing the cycle of violence. However, when he sees what Kitano, aka Murakawa, is capable of, he is scared and runs away, breaking the cycle. The film ending with Miyuki, a girl Murakawa, Kitano, saved from a rape and grew into a relationship with throughout the film. He gets into her car and then... stopping the film's incredible score in the process. Overall, this is where Kitano truly starts to realise his craft and perfect it, leading me on to his next film, the one that truly changed everything. Now, for some context, Kitano in 1994 August got into a motorcycle accident, which he later admitted to was an unconscious suicide attempt, and caused paralysis partially on his right side of his face, nearly ending his career. During this period he took up painting, which featured in art galleries and soundtrack of albums of his films. However, these would be used in his most critically acclaimed film, Hana-bi, or in English, fireworks. This is where it truly changed for Kitano. Something I've neglected to mention is the fact these films did quite poorly in Japan. Besides his non-gangster film Kid's Return, they all did really bad, and Kitano himself was never taken seriously as a filmmaker inside Japan, only really being taken seriously by the European press.
そうだよ。引き連れてますよね。王様ですね、今もう。
前回収録した後もね、終わった後ね、なんかイギリスかなんかのドキュメンタリー番組。
そうですよね、前回の収録の後。
ドキュメンタリー。
お前ら、俺は外国で結構知り渡った映画監督で。
いや、びっくりしましたよ。
お前ら本当にビートたけしだと思ってんだろ。外国がたけしKitanoったら大変だ、結構いけるんだよ、お前。
However, this film changed that, and he was finally taken seriously as a filmmaker due to winning the Golden Lion, a prestigious film award given at the Venice Film Festival, which has been won by prestigious filmmaker Akira Kurosawa, who is considered not just Japan's greatest director but one of the greatest in the medium's history, and this made a Japanese critic call Kitano the true successor to Kurosawa himself, which is a massive statement but has validity, as Kurosawa liked to use the film's visuals to its advantage, which this film also does. The film incorporates Kitano's paintings throughout it. In one particular sequence, they do it brilliantly alongside the terrific score from Hiyashi again, as the film is much more abstract than his others, with scenes like the painting scenes, the credit scenes, or the ending scene, which features minimal dialogue focusing on the waves of the sea. That all truly add to the film, as it essentially follows Kitano, a police officer, who leaves the police force after his friend is put in a wheelchair, and more importantly, he blames himself for his colleague's death, which is shown throughout the film in multiple flashbacks, haunting Kitano. Meanwhile, he decides to live his life to the fullest with his wife, who is of course dying. The latter part of that statement being what this film truly is really about, living your life to your fullest. As all the other stuff that Kitano's film would have, it does have. Bursts of brutal violence, long takes, black comedy style.
西さんの方が大変だろ。子供は死んじゃうわ。女房は病気だわ。まして仕事が刑事だ。忙しくて見舞いにも行けないんだよ。
However, this time, in my opinion, there is also more going on, with these scenes with minimal dialogue and beauty, like the painting scenes and the scenes with his wife, whether it's him cheating by looking at the card through the front mirror of his car, or him pretending to kill a bystander.
Ben.
The film also featuring probably some of the most brutal scenes in any of his films. However, a lot of it seems in some way justified, like this scene in which a guy tries to make fun of and annoy Kitano's wife, essentially calling her mentally challenged, and Kitano continuously pushing him in the water. The film's title being really smart, as it's obviously about fireworks, which there is a beautiful abstract scene in the film featuring that, incorporating Kitano's paintings alongside it. But also something beautiful fading out of existence, which in the film's final scene, Kitano kills himself and his wife. The film overall being Kitano's most critically acclaimed film, and to many people, his masterpiece, which I do agree with, as it feels like his most focused film, in my opinion. Now, after this point, Takeshi kind of just did what he wanted to, this resulting in possibly his biggest mistake / regret. That being his 2000 film, Brother, which was his attempt to get big in America, which failed, and Takeshi himself says he regrets doing it. This, alongside Takeshi's Castle, is the thing he is probably most famous for, and for good reason. He basically just plays himself, the character even being called Kitano. He's a teacher who signs up his students to the Battle Royale program to battle teenage delinquency by the totalitarian government. Of course, this isn't Kitano's film, it's filmed by the man who was supposed to film Violent Cop, and his final film ever, which is a very great, incredible final film to have, and Kitano plays a big part in that. And if you're going to be in one film, this is the one to be in, due to it kind of being one of the most influential pieces of media of all time, considering the size of media it influenced, aka Fortnite.
最後の1枚クッキーうまかったな
After this, Kitano would kinda just do random films he wanted, from Zatoichi, the Blind Swordsman, which he admitted was just for entertainment but still a great samurai flick, to his outrage series of films, to appearing in Ghost in the Shell, the first time he appeared in an American film since the 1995 film Johnny Mnemonic. And as of recently, his film appeared at the 2023 Cannes Film Festival to good reviews, but that's about it. So overall, that is my video on one of Japan's greatest filmmakers, whose work, while well known, I believe is still underrated and has some gangster films that should be up there with the greats. So yeah, a great filmmaker everybody should check out. One of the best things about film is the fact it's a visual art form and can use that to your advantage, and one country which I believe does use that to its advantage is Japan. Whilst not always making the best films, some even straight up terrible, however they do usually like to try and use the screen to its full usage. And there's one film in particular in the Yakuza genre which I am going to talk about, and the Yakuza genre specifically uses itself to its advantage, whether it's Takeshi Kitano's static cam style, Takashi Miike's totally unrealistic nature, or to one of the most famous, Seijun Suzuki, with his film Tokyo Drifter. Now it's important before going into the film to note a couple of things. First off, he had a style which is now regarded as ahead of its time, which the bosses of the company he made his films at, Nikatsu, sorry if I mispronounced that, told him to tone it down his strange, bizarre way of filming and techniques. So much so, this was one that had such a restricted budget, he wasn't allowed to film in colour for his next few films. Next is the fact the film is technically a B film, which when most people here think of that, they really think of low budget, mostly terrible films. The Room, Planet 9 from Outer Space, etc., with some good ones such as The Evil Dead, Night of the Living Dead, and Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And essentially, because of this, Suzuki would be restricted by shooting days, who he could cast, the type of scripts he would get, which mostly he wasn't able to refuse, risk losing his job if he did refuse them. And this film specifically was the last one with Nikatsu he was able to film in colour, and he sure did use that to his advantage.
親父さん、裏切ったな。兄貴!
As the restrictedness that he was giving allowed him, as well as his art director, Takeo Kimura, to think outside of the box with their use of colour and sets. And now onto the film Tokyo Drifter. Now the film's plot is essentially very strange and almost incomprehensible, which I'll get into later, but this is how Wikipedia describes it. After Yakuza boss Kuruta dissolves his own criminal empire, a rival kingpin offers a position to Kurata's top operative, Tetsuya, quote, the Phoenix Tetsu, end quote, Hondo. When the fierce loyal Tetsu declines, Otsuka taps unstoppable Tatsuyu, the Viper, a ruthless gun for hire, to assassinate him. As the Viper trails his target through the countryside, the agile Phoenix Tetsu grows concerned that one of his former associates has betrayed him. And if that sounds strange, it is. However, the plot doesn't really matter. It's more of an art piece rather than a narrative one, which is both a positive and a negative, as it allows the audience to be engrossed in the film's beautiful cinematography, multicoloured sets, the film's jazzy score, which fits incredibly with the stylish look of it. However, it does on the downside lead to the film being almost incomprehensible as to what is going on, which is both a constant decision and one that they were forced to make, as Suzuki has admitted due to the low budget of the film, there are tons of continuity errors, thus leaving the film feeling a bit disjointed. But really, apart from that, the film is great. It's quite a funny film, especially a scene in which it takes place in a saloon, which is a parody of the Western genre at the time, which was massive, with the fight being so over the top that it just makes you laugh with its outrageousness. The film was directly inspired by pop art's surrealism and its mise-en-scene type of filming, with the sets they used being heavily stylized, which they used to a tremendous effect, especially the club, which we see multiple times throughout the film, in which it's bathed in multiple colours, to give it this sense of otherworldliness. What makes these sets greater is the fact they are beautifully shown in multiple colours, from white to black to yellow, even the sky going from red to black. Overall, just a really unique looking film and just gorgeous. It's an experience that everybody should at least watch once. The colours are in your face and pretty. The sets, while simple, ooze creativity. It has a great soundtrack. The actual location scenes are fantastically shot and colour graded. Characters' costumes, colours are incredible and add to the trippy 60s look, and while it's not the most profound or even fully comprehensible film, it's one that you should seek out. All in all, it's one of the most beautiful films ever made that more people should find out and watch. Now, cinema has had its fair share of weird and wacky films. However, there's one that to me seems to stand out to me as a very strange film. Not weird like a Lynch or John Waters film, but strange in its structure, its filming style, and the point of the film as a whole. That being the 2001 film all about Lily Chou-Chou. Now, the basic plot of the film follows two high school kids in Japan named Yuichi and Hishino, and basically deals with their horrible lives, whether bullying, suicide, rape, violence in general, and their only escape being the artist Lily Chou-Chou, who didn't exist in real life, but became a thing because of this film. Now, one of the best things about the film, even if you don't like it, is the beautiful cinematography. Whether Yuichi standing in the rice fields, the nighttime almost night vision shots, to the islands of Okinawa, all done brilliantly and beautifully, and I think really make you feel what the characters are going through, a sense of not belonging and feeling lost, which the film's cinematography conveys beautifully. And it's one of the key aspects to film that makes it kind of strange, as it's a lot of brutal look away scenes, but it's contrasted by the beautiful shots. One of the best scenes being Hishino, who we see throughout the film goes from a nervous, awkward, kind student to a violent, controlling guy who forces his friends to violate and uses Suda, another female student, to prostitute herself, having this moment where he starts to break down in the field whilst listening to Lily's music. Which is a very important scene, as it shows us the audience that Hishino in some way doesn't like what he's doing, or come. The only way to let it all out is the emotion is through Lily's music. Now the film has this eclectic, almost disjointed feel. For example, the main characters and their gang want to go on holiday to Okinawa, basically Japan's paradise, however they can't afford it, and through some circumstances eventually rob a guy for his money. However, once they get to Okinawa, the film's style of filming changes to a handheld style, and gives this film this eerie feeling, which was the point according to the director. As it says, Shinoda switched to a restless, jabbing, handheld camera style for a deliberately unsettling effect. End quote. Which you definitely feel, but it's still very jarring when it happens. Now I'd like to go over the positives and the negatives of the film as a whole. First off, the negatives. The film is rather long, clocking in at about 2 hours and 26 minutes, which is a big turn off from even wanting to watch the film. Now I'm not saying people don't want to watch long films. However, given the film's reputation as depressing, it does make a large barrier of entry. Next is the story can be quite hard to follow. For example, the film is non-linear, but when watching the film, I didn't even realise personally that the film starts midway through and then flashes back, so I was a little confused for a little while. And that goes for a lot of the film, given its eclectic style, which does work most of the time. However, in my opinion, it's very confusing and jarring, and a lot of the time, it is very jarring, which for many is the main critique. Now the positives, I think the use of message boards / text messages on screen is done very, very well. Yuchi, the main character of the story, runs basically a message board for Lily Chou, where other people talk about their love for her, his name on the board being Philia, and he talks about how Lily is like John Lennon, and she is able to connect and be the ether, basically the atmosphere and the sky, which is why her songs are usually shown in the rice fields. Now what I do think they do well is contrast how people act online and how they act in real life. With Yuchi seeming quite intelligent and outgoing on the message board, however in real life is almost stilted and unable to do anything without being told to do so, like him being constantly hit and bullied throughout the film by Suda or even by his mother. Contrasted by Hoshino, who acts quite nice and sweet online, even stopping Yuchi from killing himself due to Suda also committing suicide. However, once we see him again, he cruelly acts towards Yuchi, and when they both meet up at the concert for Lily, Hoshino being nicknamed Blue Cat, Hoshino acts even cruel towards him, making Yuchi get a coke, stealing his ticket and throwing it away, thus he can't get into the Lily concert. Which I think is a genius choice, as Lily seems to be the only thing to make a lot of these characters happy in these dark, depressing times. However, we barely see her, and I think she represents a sort of good in the world and tranquility, which is why Yuchi loves her music so much. The film also portrays bullying, in my opinion, in the right way, in the sense it's over dumb, seamlessly almost unnoticeable things. For example, Kuno, who basically Yuchi has a crush on, and is bullied simply because all the boys find her more attractive than the rest of the girls. Which, on a side note, seems really dumb to me, but that's probably just a cultural difference. And because of this, the girl posse get Yoshino to threaten her, however, she's then eventually violated by Yoshino's gang. However, in a bit of empowerment, Kuno shaves her hair in defiance of Yoshino, given his gang filmed the act. As mentioned in the film earlier, when Sudo says, and thus, in a pretty well written character moment, she's able to get the better of Hoshino, as it's more than likely that Hoshino was going to use that film to blackmail Kuno into prostitution herself in some way, and in her own way fight her back against his cruel gang. And eventually, Yuchi at the concert kills Hoshino with a knife, which feels quite deserved, and Yuchi nearly kills himself by hanging himself, however, he does not. But does come the end of the film suffer from terrible grades, and Kuno seems to be slowly recovering from the incident, via her playing the piano at the end of the film, which, in my opinion, she kinda seems to represent Lily, given Kuno's lack of dialogue. And it's quite a bittersweet ending, as we never are able to see Kuno and Yuchi talk, thus leaving it up to the viewer if they ever do make that connection. So overall, I believe that's, in my opinion, the strangest film ever made. It feels good and bad at the same time, like the use of beautiful music during depressing, disgusting scenes, to the beautiful cinematography that captures the beauty and wonderful nature of rural Japan, and overall I recommend you watch and experience the film yourself. It's certainly a unique film. Now, I have made few videos on Japanese media, most of which have done quite well, and the last film I talked about, all about Lily Chou-Chou, is kind of a weird companion piece with this film that I'd like to talk about today. That being the 2001 film Blue Spring.
もう一歩左に。
いいよ俺。吉村入って俺撮るよ。相変わらず写真嫌いだな。
Now, the film is not what I was expecting on first viewing, as the film is bunched in when you watch all about Lily Chou-Chou and the recommendations in the film similar to it. However, this film, to me, is quite different from that film. Now, the general plot follows a group of high schoolers in a highly dysfunctional environment wherein violence is constantly happening They basically have the freedom to do what they want, like walking out of class or spray painting. In order to be the leader of the group, you must participate in the clapping game, in which it tests how many claps you can do whilst not holding onto the railing on the roof. Now, the film is rather depressing in tone, as these kids are basically hopeless or don't have very many options, which is the main idea and theme throughout the film, as each gang member is still trying to figure out what they want to do. The four main characters, I guess, of the film are Chou-Chou, the main protagonist, who is the leader of the gang, Aoki, Kujo's best friend and right-hand man, Yukio, and Kimura. Each character becomes increasingly disillusioned about what they want to do with their lives, resulting in life-altering decisions throughout the film. Now, unlike All About Lily Chou-Chou, it's rather straightforward and, in my opinion, much easier to follow, and less experimental. However, that does not mean it doesn't have some interesting creative choices, whether it's the cinematography, as the film is quite creative in my opinion, always changing the way in which it's shot, whether it's a POV scene, a shot reverse shot, or time-lapse, all individually creative choices, but definitely fit the film's tone. Each of the four main characters' stories each end in a somewhat tragic manner. For example, with Kimura, he decides that instead of sticking with school, he joins the Yakuza, which he acknowledges to his friend this will indeed ruin his life.
受け取り返してこい。何をでありますか。青春。
Then we get to Yukio, who is a rather interesting character, as he's shown to be prone to violence, in the sense he's always talking about it, even one of his first lines being about wanting to kill someone.
殺すよ。
Which will be reincorporated later on in the film. He's shown to be like Kujo, not really sure on what he wants in life. When asked by a teacher about his dropping grades and his dreams, he says that he has, quote, vague dreams, like world peace. And we get an interesting conversation with Yukio and Kujo where they both discuss their lack of ideas on where and what they want to do with their lives.
どうするの？就職？進学？俺はウルトラ警備隊。それバイト？
This lack of idea in his life culminates in the bathroom scene in which the character Ota, who Yukio is shown to dislike due to his sucking up nature, are in the bathroom, and Yukio, in a fit of confusion and anger, decides to kill him. After which, Yukio is shown to be on the stairs smoking and says this to his teacher.
死ぬか？ Peace.
Which is of course an example of the film's great reincorporation of ideas, as he's shown to want world peace, thus him saying peace, and of course the irony of him saying this after doing the opposite act of peace. The scene is made even better by him playing Beautiful Dreamer on the guitar, which is a song which is written from the perspective of someone who doesn't have anything to care about, and is possibly dead, and of course symbolises the themes of dreams and youth throughout the film. And in his arrest scene, you get to see a more vulnerable side to him, which is a rather visceral scene in which I think is portrayed brilliantly and is quite heartbreaking. Now, Aoki and Chou-Chou are interlinked characters and looks up to him. However, due to Kujo's laid-back, bored attitude, it's shown to really anger Aoki due to Chou-Chou not really using his fear factor around the school cause much violence. Him only really doing so when threatened, and eventually after the group splits up with Yuki's arrest and Kimura leaving to join the Yakuza, even people start losing their fear of Aoki and Chou-Chou. It leads to Aoki starting to dislike Chou-Chou and thus becoming the main bully of the school, wherein he adopts a much more rogue army-like haircut and causes chaos around the school, and starts to lose his mind,
which is demonstrated quite well with the increasing nature of the black spray paint across the skull, which coincides with both his psyche and the drawing which Chou-Chou draws on his desk, which is reincorporated in the final shot of the film, with the drawing symbolising Chou-Chou's lack of identity and the anger and fear he's feeling. Thus, it's rather horror, scary-looking style, and I think reflects Chou-Chou's apathy throughout the film. Eventually, Chou-Chou confronts Aoki in a tremendously well-done scene in which he uses his own cigarette to light Aoki's lit cigarette, which is quite a cool scene, and shows, I think, both Chou-Chou's superiority to Aoki, which has been increasingly made aware of throughout the film, but also the connection between them, as despite their anger towards each other, Chou-Chou, despite his condescending nature, still respects Aoki and likes him as his best friend. However, does attack him due to them both disagreeing about their situation, with Aoki becoming increasingly nihilistic in his viewpoint, whilst Chou-Chou is shown to be increasingly much more hopeful, and seems to, at least in my opinion, be more focused on school and what he wants to do with his life. There's even a butterfly behind them, which usually is a symbol of rebirth, i.e. an epiphany, which Chou-Chou seems to have. However, notice it's painted black, which is intentional, which I'll get back to later. The scene shows the fundamental difference in each of their viewpoints, Aoki more nihilistic and destructive, and Chou-Chou becoming much more hopeful, thus culminating in Aoki snapping, painting nearly a whole room in black spray paint, and eventually himself, his hand fully black, and his face nearly all as well, in which we get a great time-lapse shot, which is just beautiful in my opinion, as it perfectly illustrates how each character feels like they're insignificant and their lack of identity in this world. And eventually he begins to play the clapping game. Chou-Chou tries to save him, however he's too late. Aoki jumps off, dying, leaving Chou-Chou with his drawing and his shadow beside it, in a very powerful final shot. Whilst the film is bleak, it's not overly depressing in tone. It's a film that shows the consequences of violence and the need for role models in everybody's life, and of course the consequences of people's actions. And one of the key motifs of the film is the flower, which Chou-Chou is growing. He originally starts to grow them with Kimura and Yukio, and even saying he should grow a black flower, showing his nihilistic viewpoint, also the fact that black represents despair and chaos, and specifically in this film. Thus Aoki increasingly using it throughout the film. Chou-Chou continues to grow it throughout the film, eventually saying to his teacher,
"Sensei, 咲かない花もあるんじゃないですか?"
which, whilst on the nose, is still well written and shows Chou-Chou's fear and lack of direction in his life, and his fear for what is going to happen to Aoki given his new lifestyle. Another thing that film clearly portrays is that they all have potential to achieve something outside of their violent lifestyle, whether it's Yukio with his guitar playing, Kimura with his baseball, and Chou-Chou is shown to be a promising footballer, and Aoki is shown to be a very capable person, physically and leadership-wise. However, they either ignore these traits of themselves or don't apply these skills in the right way, which of course adds to the film's tragedy. Overall, a terrifically well-written, acted film with creativity all throughout the film, mostly working in my opinion, and I highly recommend the film, as it has important themes about youth, violence, and disillusionment. There has always been in film strange and weird films, from the work of John Waters to David Lynch, and several others. However, there is one that I recently watched and it completely baffled me, that being 1974's Pastoral to Die in the Country. The film's plot, if you can call it that, isn't very clear for the first 40 minutes of the film. The film starts with a child playing hide and seek with other children who hide away and then shout when they are ready. However, they turn into adults. Immediately, it's made clear the film's weirdness with the opening scene of a group of people walking around a mountain with this hazy purple filter over the film. The first half of the film follows a 15-year-old boy known as Shin-chan, who lives in a rural village in Japan with his mom. And one of our first scenes with him, we see his fascination with his neighbour, which results in this line.
母ちゃん 俺川かむりの手術しようと思うんだ。何の手術だって？
Which isn't even the weirdest thing in this film. And one thing you will notice throughout the film is that some characters' faces are painted white, some of which aren't. This is of course never addressed. There are theories as to what it means, which I'll get into later on in the video, but in the film it's never even mentioned. Through the first half, we encounter several characters who are all wacky, and the film's colouring gets even stranger, whether it be the circus, which features this almost rainbow-like effect to it, to Shin-chan walking on a beach with the sky's colour being red and the water and beach being light purple. The key theme that we see is Shin and him becoming much more sexually curious, where we see his fascination with his neighbour, wherein she asks him to run away with her on a train. As we see throughout the film, Shin is fascinated by trains, due to never being on one, and even pretends to be one in order to impress his neighbour. She says that she wants to elope with her lover, which Shin looks the definition of in a dictionary, which excites him. He goes on the run with his. During a scene in which Shin visits the circus, he looks through the tent and sees a threesome taking place, rather graphically shown. And during the circus scene, there is a woman who uses a flat suit. However, she of course needs it to be pumped up in order to perform. And the film, in my opinion, makes it clear that the pumping up of her suit is a sexual metaphor, as her husband is a dwarf who we see gets jealous when another man pumps her up, which her face during the pumping up action is one of satisfaction. He even asks her, how is it? As we see Shin trying to pump her up, however he fails. We also see a woman give birth, which Shin witnesses directly. That woman will be important later on towards the end of the film, which I'll come back to later on. Shin manages to escape from his mother after a struggle, and he and his neighbour find themselves on a train track. However, turns out that the film is a film within it about a director making a film about his childhood past, and has up to this point creative block on how he can finish the film. Now this twist I think makes the film much more interesting and offers some explanation about the first half, as he says to the critics and people watching a viewing of it, the first 40 minutes of the film, that most of his past is lies or exaggerated, and actually he feels guilty about it, as he feels as though he's exploiting his childhood. However, he has a very interesting conversation with a friend, wherein he explains this. However, the friend brings up a very integral point about the past.
夢を計画的に見たり、記憶を自在に編集できるようじゃなくちゃ、本物の作家とは言えないな。
This idea about his past being fictional is something I'll speak about later on in the video. And also during this small talk with his friend, they bring up in conversation the grandmother paradox, wherein if a person were to travel back in time to kill their grandmother, would they themselves cease to exist? However, this creates a contradiction because their existence is necessary for the original time for him to travel back in the first place. Eventually, the director heads back to his editing room, wherein outside he meets Shin and then explains his lies, ending on the line,
私の少年時代は私の嘘だったのだ。
Film then resumes. Shin, by himself, eventually finds his neighbour, who it turns out that he wasn't the person she wanted to elope with. It was a random guy. The man asks him to sit down, and the neighbour eventually tells her backstory of her harsh childhood during World War II, and eventually having to prostitute herself to survive. We cut back to the director, who admits he has no idea how to finish the film, so decides to travel back in time. The director travels back in time and meets up with Shin, who has been asked to join the neighbour and run away with them. Before doing so, they ask him to go fetch them some sake, which he does, wherein the two of them meet each other, Shin and the director that is, and upon their return to the neighbours, yeah, they died. They strangled themselves. Now during all of this, the villagers have been blaming the newborn baby for misfortunes such as a dog's death on the baby, and eventually they force the lady into dispatching her child in the river, which she does so. The director, now at the circus, receives a letter in a very strange way.
as we see various different acts run into the tent. However, once he opens it, they're all gone, alongside the postboy who delivered the letter. The director and Shin play a game of chess. Shin tells him about what he intends to do when he grows up, but of course the director tells him what Shin will actually go on to do. Shin questions him further, however the director won't budge and reveal what will happen to Shin in the future. During all of this, there are several things going on in the background, from a giant finger pointing to the right of the screen, to a guy getting a haircut, to giant matches. The director saying to Shin that the past can always be rearranged. A man and a boy then walk into the screen, and that man breaks the fourth wall, saying what he will do in the future, and then gets angry out of nowhere. Their mother is brought up into the conversation, when eventually the director asks Shin if he could kill his past mother, in order to see whether or not the grandmother paradox would work. Eventually Shin agrees, and on his way encounters the woman who dispatched of her baby. He constantly questions him about life in the village, and eventually assaults Shin in a rather brutal scene, which after this event he feels disgraced, and the woman says she can take him to Tokyo. The director now feels abandoned and betrayed by his past self, and decides that he must kill his mother. He reaches her, however she invites him to sit and eat. He does so, and says that and eventually the background falls down and we see the director and his mother in the present day Tokyo. They continue to chat, however we aren't able to hear any of it, and in the background are several of the film's characters who eventually walk off the distance. The credits roll. Thus, the ending of a film I consider to be one of, if not the weirdest films ever made. Now the film is essentially a kind of false/fake biopic about a director's past life, wherein we don't know if any of it is real or if it is truly all fake, and also acts like an almost self-reflection/psychotherapy session on himself from the director. On another video I did on a Japanese film director, Takeshi Kitano, this idea of a kind of autobiographical idea is there in his second film, Boiling Point. When we come to the end of that film, you are led to question if the main character, who can be a stand-in for Kitano the director, made up the entire movie's plot in his head, much like in Pastoral. You question that idea as well. Now, one of the biggest, if not the main theme throughout the film, in my opinion, is Shin's relationship with sex. As we see throughout the film that he is a hormonal teenager and almost desperate to have sex, which he does eventually get, however the tragedy of it is the way in which he gets it, unconsensual. The film features this almost Oedipus complex idea with Shin and his mother, who is shown to be very overbearing over Shin, and the film I think implies an almost sexual nature to their relationship. Whilst not shown directly, it is hinted at. For example, after his assault, the woman says she can take Shin to Tokyo with her. The next time we see Shin, he is with his mother in Tokyo. The woman I think being a parallel with Shin's mother, giving both of them being mothers, but also in terms of their age matching up with the time period of when adult Shin is with his mother, as both Shin and the woman would be around the same age as the characters in the ending scene. There are also several other aspects to the film which are very mysterious, like the white face paint which some but not all characters wear, which I think perhaps hints at which characters are real and which aren't, those without it being real and those with it not, and gives characters this almost ghost-like feel, perhaps visually hinting towards the director's lies, as Shin, aka himself, features the most white makeup and it heavily obscures his features, compared to his mother, who does wear paint, however, it's almost worn out and you can see the details in her face. Overall, this film is, whilst not for everyone, a very interesting film and is very strange, and ponders interesting questions about someone's past and if lying about it is okay, and even the limitations of film as a overall a very surreal, wacky, and of course, weird film.